It's a crisp autumn dawn roughly 3,000 years ago in the Nile Delta. You wake up on a reed mat, look out through the courtyard window as the morning mist rises off the water, and you feel a cold knot of panic tighten in your stomach. Your cycle is late. Today, that realization sets off a highly predictable sequence of modern events. You walk to a brightly lit pharmacy, buy a plastic stick, and wait 3 minutes for a chemical readout. But on this morning, 30 centuries ago, there are no pharmacies. There are no plastics. There is only you, the quiet rustle of the papyrus outside, and a brutal mathematical equation running through your head. Because in the ancient world, having a child wasn't just a matter of nursery decor or choosing a name. It was a high-stakes calculation of caloric math. If you were a nomadic hunter-gatherer moving 20 miles a day to follow the gazelle herds, carrying 2 toddlers simultaneously wasn't just exhausting, it was a logistical impossibility that could endanger the survival of the entire tribe. Even in the early farming villages, an extra mouth to feed during a year of low harvest could mean the difference between a family making it through the winter or quietly starving before the spring thaw. We tend to think of family planning as a modern invention, a luxury born of 20th century labs, public policy debates, and rubber manufacturing. We look back at our ancestors and assume they were entirely helpless against their own biology, trapped in a cycle of perpetual accidental reproduction. Except the history tells a completely different story. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that human beings figured out how to manage their fertility long before they figured out how to smelt iron or build a proper arch. Our ancestors were not passive victims of nature, they were active, obsessive engineers of it. And the ways they dealt with unwanted pregnancies are brilliant, terrifying, and occasionally involve a wild plant so unbelievably effective that an entire empire literally ate it into extinction. Let that sit for a moment. But before we talk about the billionaire Romans and their missing miracle herb, we need to understand the original baseline. The savage reality of the savannah, and the hidden bodily mechanism that protected our species before we ever invented medicine. For about 95% of human history, we didn't live in houses and we didn't stay put. We roamed. And on the trail, a nomadic mother faced a serious biological problem. Human infants are remarkably useless compared to other primates. They can't cling to our fur because, well, we lost it. A mother had to carry her child everywhere. Genetic evidence shows that hunter-gatherer women naturally space their pregnancies out by nearly 4 years. How? Without pills or barriers, they relied on something called lactational amenorrhea, an intense, multi-year breastfeeding routine combined with a low-fat, high-mobility diet that effectively shut down ovulation. It was nature's original pause button. But then, around 10,000 years ago, we made a choice that changed everything. We settled down, and when we stopped moving, the biological pause button broke. The Neolithic Revolution wasn't just about planting wheat, it was a nutritional earthquake. Stable, carbohydrate-rich diets meant something the human body hadn't experienced in millennia: consistent body fat. And consistent body fat meant regular ovulation. Weaning happened earlier because soft grains could replace breast milk. Mobility dropped because why walk 20 miles when your food grows in the same field every season? The result was blunt and immediate. Birth rates exploded. And unwanted pregnancy stopped being a rare biological hiccup and became a structural, recurring crisis for every mud brick village on the map. So humanity had to do something it had never really needed to do before: intervene. Deliberately, mechanically, chemically. No more relying on a slow, natural rhythm. Now it was active management, herbs measured by hand, recipes passed in whispers, timing tracked against the moon. We had to invent contraception, which brings us to Egypt and one of the strangest medical documents in human history. The Kahun Papyrus, dated to around 1800 BCE, is essentially a gynecological manual, the oldest one we have. And buried inside its faded columns are contraceptive recipes that sound, to modern ears, absolutely unhinged. One recipe calls for a paste of crocodile dung mixed with fermented dough, inserted before intercourse. Another, found later in the Ebers Papyrus, calls for a plug of lint soaked in a mixture of acacia leaves, dates, and honey. Now it's tempting to laugh. Crocodile dung. It sounds like a punchline. But here's where the story stops being funny and starts being genuinely impressive. Acacia gum, when it ferments, produces lactic acid. And lactic acid is, still, today, the active spermicidal ingredient in some modern contraceptive gels. The ancient Egyptians didn't have microscopes. They had never seen a sperm cell, had no concept of an egg, no framework for fertilization at all. And yet, through what must have been centuries of trial, error, and quiet observation, they landed on a chemical barrier method that modern chemistry would later validate. The dung, meanwhile, likely worked by altering vaginal pH, creating an environment hostile to sperm survival. Crude, unpleasant, but not nonsense. This is the pattern we'll see again and again in this story. Ancient people rarely understood the why, but they were relentless empiricists about the what works. Generations of quiet trial and error passed down mother to daughter, priestess to patient, until an entire pharmacy of working solutions existed, centuries before anyone could explain the biology behind them. No pharmacies, no plastics, no microscopes, just observation, repetition, and results. And that Egyptian pharmacy was just the opening act, because across the Mediterranean, a different civilization was about to discover something even more powerful. A plant so effective, so valuable, that people would eventually pay its weight in silver, and then destroy it completely. Picture the coast of Cyrene, a Greek colony on the edge of what is now Libya. A narrow strip of land, maybe 200 miles long, with a very particular climate, and growing wild across its hills, a giant, shaggy fennel plant called Silphium. Silphium could not be farmed. Every attempt at cultivation failed. It only grew wild in that one narrow strip under conditions nobody could replicate, which, economically speaking, is the ancient equivalent of controlling the only diamond mine on Earth. And what made Silphium valuable wasn't its taste, although it was apparently used as a seasoning too. It was its resin. Taken orally, Silphium resin functioned as both a contraceptive and, in higher doses, an abortifacient. And by most historical accounts, it worked reliably. This wasn't some fringe folk remedy. This was mainstream, empire-level medicine. Julius Caesar reportedly kept 1,500 pounds of Silphium resin in the Roman state treasury, stored alongside gold bullion. Think about that for a second. Not in a temple, not in a physician's cupboard, in the treasury, next to the money. Because at that point, it basically was money. Coins minted in Cyrene depict the Silphium plant directly on their face. A civilization literally putting its most valuable export on its currency, the way we might put an oil derrick or a gold bar. And the seed pod of that plant, split down the middle, had a very particular shape. Rounded lobes, a tapered point at the bottom, a heart. Let that sit for a moment. The heart symbol we draw today, on Valentine's cards, in text messages, tattooed on forearms, is not anatomically a human heart. Nobody has ever looked at a human heart and thought, yes, that. It's the Silphium seed pod. Our single most universal symbol of love and romance began its life as a brand logo for ancient birth control. We've been drawing a contraceptive advertisement on greeting cards for 2,000 years and didn't even know it. But here's the tragedy underneath the trivia. Because Silphium only grew wild, and because an entire empire's worth of demand was pressing down on one narrow strip of Libyan coastline, the plant was harvested faster than it could ever reproduce. No cultivation, no backup supply, just extraction, relentless and unmanaged for centuries. By the time of Emperor Nero in the 1st century CE, Silphium had become vanishingly rare. And according to the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, the very last known stock ever found was presented to Nero himself, who, according to the story, ate it. Not planted it, not preserved it, ate it. After that, Silphium vanishes from the historical record entirely. One of antiquity's most important medical technologies, driven extinct by its own success within a few generations. No specimens, no seeds, no known descendant species we can confirm. Humanity accidentally deleted an entire branch of its own pharmacy and left behind only a shape, drawn in the margins of history, that we still doodle without a second thought. Of course, no contraceptive method in the ancient world was foolproof. Not the crocodile dung, not the Silphium. And when prevention failed, ancient people faced a much darker set of choices. This next part isn't comfortable. It isn't meant to be. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, women turned to a dangerous botanical pharmacy of abortifacients. Chief among them, pennyroyal, a member of the mint family, brewed into a bitter tea. And pennyroyal worked sometimes. But the margin between an effective dose and a lethal one was razor thin. Too little, and the pregnancy continued. Too much, and you destroyed your own liver in the process. This wasn't medicine in the modern, controlled sense. It was a gamble, played with your own body, against your own biology, with no dosage chart and no emergency room waiting on the other side. And the moral framing around all of this looked very different than it does today. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, discussed early-term abortion not as a spiritual transgression, but as a practical instrument of population management, something a household or a city-state might reasonably use to keep its numbers in balance with its resources. The soul, in his framework, arrived later in gestation. Before that point, it was simply a civic decision, not a sacred one. And when every other option failed, when the harvest was too thin, or the tribe was already stretched past its limits, some ancient communities turned to the most brutal solution available: infanticide, or ritualized exposure of a newborn. It's an agonizing thing to say out loud. And it should be. But it existed, historically, as the last mechanism in a chain of decisions that stretched all the way back to a woman noticing her cycle was late and doing the caloric math in her head. Which brings us back to that reed mat in the Nile Delta. That woman, 3,000 years ago, staring at the mist over the water isn't so different from a woman standing in a fluorescent-lit pharmacy aisle today, reading the back of a box. Different tools, different chemistry, same cold knot of panic, same quiet calculation, the desire to choose when, how, and with whom we bring new life into this world isn't a modern political stance or a byproduct of contemporary culture wars. It's older than agriculture, older than writing. It's a survival mechanism as old as human consciousness itself, etched into papyrus, minted onto coins, and apparently doodled onto every Valentine's card we've ever made. We get cold. We get creative. We survive. So next time you draw a little heart in the corner of a note, you might be looking at the ghost of an extinct Roman contraceptive. Kind of changes the whole Valentine's Day thing, doesn't it? Look at the records yourself and tell us below. Did you know where that shape actually came from? We read every response.